Thomas Besprel. I'm the resident writing consultant here at the CBS Library. Today's talk is about the art of reading and how it goes into the art of learning in general at a university in an academic setting. And last week when we were talking about this, I drew a picture on the board, and I'm going to draw another one today. It'll be the same picture. We're going to be doing this quite a few times because I think of this as kind of a symbol of learning in a university environment. I'm going to make sure that this fits nicely. And so you'll recognize this, of course, as the universal symbol of icebergs. And the reason that we start with an iceberg, certainly when I talk about learning and writing in general, writing and learning in general, the reason that we start with an iceberg is that Hemingway said that the dignity of movement of an iceberg lies in only 1/8 of it being above water. So the dignity of knowledge, the dignity of having academic knowledge, the dignity of being a knowledgeable person lies in everything you have under the surface, right? Everything that you aren't explicitly demonstrating, but everything that is held back in reserve, right? That's really where this sort of being a knowledgeable person comes from. It's all the things you don't say, right? You don't need to say. So this competence of knowing is a depth, right? It's not just something you're able to improvise, it's something you have with you as a depth. And the question is, how do you cultivate that? How do you kind of figure this out? And there's really 3 sort of surface performances that I like to emphasize when we talk about knowledge, right? So one of them is you're better able to think than most people. You're better able to make up your mind about things. You're certainly better able to talk as well, and you're better able to write. And this is all stuff I went through last week, so you can go back to that if you want. And then under the surface of this, right, there's a lot of resources, right? And one of those resources that we're going to look at today is if you're better able to make up your mind about things, if you're better able to think things through, like if you get a case or a situation or a set of data, you could even be in a real life work situation, right? And you're just better able to make up your mind about what's going on and what needs to be done, right? One of the reasons for that is that you have some reading in your iceberg, right? This is one of the resources that you have, right? And we'll go back to that. This is only one component in a moment, but we'll do that by way of the text we're reading. So we'll say, well, how do they know what's in their iceberg? And we'll try to unpack that in the same way that we did for us last week. So we'll get back to that in that kind of way. But this reading that you're doing really, and I'm going to try to divide it into 2 broad categories of things that you might be reading, 2 broad kinds of things that you might be reading. One of them I'm going to call documentation. And this is where this is going to get cleaner, documents, right? And the other one is what we'll call literature proper. So actual literature, right? So I want to look at 2 sets of things that you might have underneath your knowledge competence as part of your reading, and we'll look at how to read these things, how to understand them. And by documents, I mean this very broad class of things, right? So there are always going to be things that are publicly available. So there are things you're going to be able to refer to, right? So it's not stuff that you have seen somewhere, you think maybe. It is something you're able to cite and refer to. You're able to sort of say, here's something, right? And I know this because I've read this document, right? I have it in this, I have this source. And some of them are going to be like newspapers, right? And some of them are going to be magazines. And some of them are going to be company reports. Company reports, sometimes consultancy reports. There's lots of material circulating right now that's being produced, white papers of all kinds, working papers. So companies are producing a lot of information, a lot of reading material, right? that you can look at, read, and try to get information out of, right? And I've brought some of these for you to look at, because they're quite interesting, some of them. So you'll have like the New Scientist, right? That's one of the things that you could certainly read to get sort of updated on what's going on in research and science. Got the Financial Times. I should probably be reading that. Probably reading the Financial Times every once in a while, right? A useful thing. And then there's some other ones that here's something else. The various business reviews, like the MIT Management Review, or the Harvard Business Review, that kind of thing. Those are certainly things that are also worth reading. Here's something that I highly recommend, The Economist, right? And there's actually 2 reasons to read The Economist. And one of them is the same reason that you should probably also read The New Yorker. And of course, all of this is material we have in the library, usually either in paper form or in electronic form. But The Economist and The New Yorker and things like Harper's, very good things to read if you're looking for examples of prose, right? If you're looking for things that are high quality writing, well edited, right? So things you can safely emulate, things you can safely learn from as far as how to write. So one of the things you'll be reading for is to find a kind of style. And some of these sources are good ones to look at for that. Right? So I definitely encourage you to do that. Read these different things, both for the way they contribute to your knowledge and for the way they contribute to your style. Right? Yes, sir.
Isn't the New Yorker too casually phrased to be suitable for academic writing?
So the question is the New Yorker too casually written? Is it too, we might want to too colloquial and expression, too much like spoken language? Here's my take on this. The same could be said of The Economist, right? This is very simple prose. Some people say that these magazines are written at grammatically a 6th grade level, right? And that's actually not a bad kind of standard. They're written in the simplest possible way, right? What you want to do is learn from them how to say things that can be said simply. And then you want to take the very complicated things that you want to say in your academic writing, right? And you want to say it as simply as possible. And the barrier there becomes the content that you're writing about. But the actual stylistic ideal is certainly still there. And I would actually say, to the New Yorker's credit, I mean, I don't think we should say it's at a 6th grade level. I think that it's written often with some but some literary pretensions, right? So it does have an ambition to be really, really high quality prose. That's true of the New Yorker, it's true of The Economist, and many other many other magazines, I should say, right? So definitely don't shy away from that. We'll talk a little bit about that as well when we talk about reading books. So that's some of the materials that you could read. And obviously, read them regularly and don't make it a burden, right? Make it just part of your life to read these kinds of things. And I would emphasize, every once in a while, read an annual report, right? That's a good thing to just kind of, what does that really read like? What does it look like? That's probably not the best prose in the world. And some of these consultancy reports and stuff like that as well. So just get a feel for that. I just noticed I should. Good. Good. Then there is this question of reading books. And one of the things that is very, very important to keep in mind when you're at university is that some of the books you're going to be reading are textbooks, right? And some of the books you're going to be reading are going to be course compendia, right? So you'll be given a A4 typed up, bound collection of texts, And the problem with those, obviously they're very convenient. It's nice to have a collection of texts to read. That's very convenient. But the problem with them is that what they do is they detach the text that you're reading from its original source. So there's really two kinds of texts you get a lot of when you're in school, when you're at university. One of them is textbooks, and one of them is these compendia, right? And what I want to try to do is deconstruct them just a little bit so that we can get a handle on what is it we're actually reading? What is this actually giving us access to, right? One of the things you might get in a compendium is a journal article. So what you might find is that your teachers would like you to read a scientific journal article, right? And the important thing to keep in mind is that they actually come in actual journals, right? So they come in these things. That's how they normally are produced. Of course, this is from 2020, so it's not a relic from the olden days, but most researchers today don't read journal articles in journals like this, in paper journals. What they will do instead is they will find them online on the journal's websites or on the publisher's websites, but they're still organized so that they will have a volume number and an issue number, right? I'll show the camera here. And they'll have a number of essays. And every once in a while, it can be a useful thing for you to do to take one of the articles that you've been given direct access to in a compendium or through your learning module, through Canvas, right? So you've clicked right through and you've got the article and you've just read the article. Just every once in a while, look it up, right? Look it up in the journal that it appeared in, just to see what kind of context it was published in originally, right? So that can be a useful thing to do. You don't have to get the paper copy. You can do this online as well. So that's definitely one thing to keep in mind. And the other thing to keep in mind, to connect that to what I was saying earlier about textbooks, right, is that the textbooks that you read, right, are summarizing a lot of this information, usually in a way that is trying to teach it to people that the textbook expects to be unfamiliar with the material. So you'll find one style of expression in a textbook, which is directed at students, right? It's directed at people who need to be introduced to this material. And then you'll get some of the same ideas, often referenced in the textbook, in journal articles, but now they're directed to a completely different audience. They're directed to the authors, the researchers' peers. So the journal article is written at eye level with the reader, expecting the reader to be able to understand, right? But the textbook is written sort of looking down on the reader. You know, I know things and I'm going to tell you what's true, right? It's very important just to make that distinction when you're reading. And then, like I like to say, try not to take the textbook too seriously, right? It's trying to do something very, very efficiently. It's trying to get a lot of things kind of into your heads, right? And it's up to you to figure out how much of that is actually useful to you and how much about what you actually want to get out of it in a dialogue with these journal articles that you'll also be reading, right? So we've already got things to add to our iceberg here, right? We've got journal articles. We'll put textbooks first, textbooks. Journal articles. Hey, welcome. And then we'll get to books in a moment. I'll just put them down already, right? So we've got textbooks, journal articles, and books. And these are things that you will be encountering during your studies. I've brought some books as well, because books come in all different kinds. Actually, I wanted to show you the difference between two very different books, although they're by the same author. So this is somebody you might recognize, Carl Weick, Sense Making in Organizations, very classic book from 1995. This is what we call a monograph, right? So it's a book written by a single author, right? And it's written in chapters, and it presents an idea, right? It presents what the author thinks about that, right? So it's an important thing to keep in mind that these books exist. 2 or 3, 150, 200, 300 pages of one person developing an idea, right? So you're engaging with one person's mind. Now, what you'll often find in your classes is you're given a chapter to read, right? One of the chapters, usually the one that maybe has caused the greatest impact on the discipline that you're studying. And sometimes it can be a really good idea to go back to the original book, right? And read the preface, read the introduction, right? Look at some of the other chapters and see what else is in it, right? So that you're not just getting that extract, right? So just look at it. And again, we have access to that in the library. And then there's this one, and it, superficially, they're quite different. One is a little bit bigger. This one's quite a bit bigger. They're written by the same author. They're called almost the same thing, right? So that, but this one's called Making Sense of the Organization, and it's actually a collection of papers that Carl Weick has published in other journals, right? In journals, various places. So it's sort of a collection of his thinking over time, right? It's just important to distinguish those things from each other, right? So there's sometimes you've got a collection of papers, and sometimes you've got a single monograph that develops one kind of thought. And then, of course, there are anthologies which collect the thoughts of different people in the same book, right? So that's another option, right? That you have contributions from different people. And sometimes those are originally published as anthologies, right? Sometimes as collections of essays, right? And sometimes they're gathered together as things published over a period of time by different people on the same subject, right? So keep that in mind as well. We're getting through this. This kind of book here, you can see it's kind of a little bit older looking and hard covered and so forth, right? One of the things we have in the library, and it's really worth checking up on, you'll see them cited a lot in your course materials and in the articles that you read. It's just classic books, books that are, it can be, this one is almost 100 years old, by Mary Parker Follett, right? And she, lots of people have been very, very inspired by her, even people who've read her recently, right? So this is something that is worth picking up, and then maybe even sitting down and reading it sort of cover to cover. There's lots of different things that I would encourage you to do when you pick up a classic, an older book, like a book from 60 or 100 years ago, is you'll notice, one of the things you'll notice is that they're nicer to read. The printing, the typeface is simply more pleasant. And just the way the words are on the page, just a little nicer than some of the newly printed things with the papers just a little bit different and the type is a little bit different. So have a look at that and know that they're there and know that you can look them up. And then I also wanted to just show you this one. This is see, this is David Tease's Dynamic Capabilities and Strategic Management. Some of you may run into dynamic capabilities at some point. And I just wanted to read something from the preface to this. This is one of the reasons to read a preface, because he'll tell us something that we can actually use to talk about reading books in general, right? Because this is what he says at the end of the preface. He says, "It is hoped that this book will provide new insights to readers not familiar with the literature on dynamic capabilities. To those already familiar with the literature, it is hoped that this book will help mold disparate ideas and observations together in such a way that it stimulates deeper insights into business and economic phenomena and impact society, and that impact society. It is my sincerest wish that managers who read on, right, will become more astute and reflective managers, and scholars who read on will grow more insightful and will join the endeavor to create a knowledge-based theory of the firm." Right? So notice how many different audiences he's thinking of, right? He's thinking of people who are not familiar with the subject, so maybe students and so forth. He's thinking of people who are familiar with the subject. He's thinking about managers and he's thinking about scholars, right? So when you read the book, right, then you can think, am I reading this as a future manager, right? Am I reading this as a student who is trying to become a scholar, right? Am I reading this as somebody who's already familiar with the subject because I've taken a course on dynamic capabilities, right? So I'm going at it with that perspective. Or am I reading this as a student who's just hearing about dynamic capabilities, thought it sounded interesting in the introductory lecture of the class, right? And now I'm going to get the book out of the library and just read it on the weekend, right? Which is perfectly legitimate, right? That's one of the things you can do, yeah? So just keep that in mind, that books have that much wider range of audience. They have a much wider sense of who is my audience. Whereas journal articles are written specifically for other scholars, right? Textbooks are written for students, right? So they're directing themselves as people, usually people in your situation, right? In taking classes. Newspapers, magazines, and so forth are directed at the public, right? The general reader. So just keep that in mind. Keep in mind that you are being addressed as different kinds of people in different kinds of situations, right? And not to take all writing as the same sort of thing, right? Good. I'm going to draw another iceberg now. And the reason I'm going to draw another iceberg is because I want to think about what we do when we read a text, right? So let's assume we have a text that we're reading and we want to try to figure out what is it based on, right? So we've decided that when we think, talk, and write, one of the things we draw on is reading, right? But we don't want to live in a world. I mean, I think this would be kind of a sad world, right? Where everything we read is also just based on reading, right? So all the texts we read, the only thing we're worried about is what are their sources, right? What reading is that coming from, right? So what we want to do is try to analyze what the texts that we're reading say in such a way that it gets at a variety of foundations that writers have for writing. And then we can also see the foundations that we have ourselves. So those of you who were here last week will recognize the schema that we're going to use, but notice how differently we're using it here, right? There's a very, I quoted this on the blog yesterday, but there's a very famous literary scholar, English scholar, a rhetorician as well. And he's also the main author of a very, very useful book called The Craft of Research, which I certainly recommend to everybody. A man named Wayne C. Booth, who is totally recommended. And of course, links and references will be available on the blog. But he, in a preface to his Rhetoric of Irony, tells this little anecdote. He says, I've heard it said that there's really only two questions that they ask at Oxford in the tutorials of a text. What is the author trying to say? And how does the author know? Right? What is the author trying to say? And how does the author know? And so what we can actually do is we can put that in our little schema here, right? We can say, what is the author trying to say, right? And then we can say, how does the author know? Right? We can ask those two questions of any text, right? And I will take this down to a very detailed level in a moment, but just think about that. You read a chapter in a book, you read a journal article, right? Or you read a chapter in a textbook or a section of a textbook, or you even read a newspaper article or a company report or a magazine article, right? You read any of these texts and you just ask yourself, what is it trying to tell me? What is it saying I should believe? And then you take that and then you ask, how does the author know, right? And if we take a standard sort of scholarly presentation, so if we take a presentation in a journal article, so somebody's done a study, somebody's done some research, and they're presenting this to you, right? If we take that and we try to analyze it, then we'll find that there's different things that they're trying to tell us, right? They're trying to tell us things of a background nature. They're probably going to tell us something about theory, right? They're going to tell us something about their method. They're going to try to tell us something about their analysis, right? Their results, maybe, right? So they'll tell us about that. And they will probably tell us something about what they think the implications of all their research are, right? So usually when you're reading a journal article or a book on any subject, right? What you can do is you can say, well, what kind of background information are they giving me? What kind of theory are they explaining to me? Yes, sir? The last one's discussion. And like I said, there'll be a cleaner rendering of this online in a moment, or in a few hours. So the discussion, that's where the implications, like either the implications for practice or the implications for future research, right? So when we're reading a journal article, we can look at these things, and it's not always that there'll be a nice clear title. It says, this is the theory section, right? This is the analysis, right? But what we're going to ask ourselves is, what is the author trying to tell us about the company or region that this paper is about the theories that are being used, right? About the methods that they use to gather and analyze the data, about the analysis itself, so about the data itself, and about the discussion, right? About the implications. And then the question is, how do they know? How do they know these things, right? And this is where it gets interesting, right? Because some of it is going to be reading, right? In fact, the background section is going to be based on documents. So when we look at the background section, we're going to be looking at the things that we could find in the library to check whether or not they're right. Right, so we're reading the background section, all the background information about the company or the market or the industry and all that kind of stuff. So whenever we're reading that section, we're going to be looking for the documentation. Right, we're going to ask them to show us how they know. Right, and they will be giving us company reports, newspaper articles, sometimes history books. Right, there'll be lots of things that they'll cite, but they'll be giving us some kind of documentation for that. And when they're trying to explain their theory, they're going to be citing the journal articles and maybe also the theory books, right? But they will be citing the literature. It's very rare that a journal article will cite a textbook, right? Because remember, it's not the right audience, right? So they may cite monographs like the ones that I was talking about, like the Carl Weick book or the Tees book, but they're very rarely going to cite what we would recognize as textbooks from our courses. So even though they appear authoritative to us, right, they're not going to be used by scholars as authoritative sources very often. There are some exceptions to that because some textbooks are so classic, right, that they're still used as textbooks and also used as authorities. But they will be citing these journal articles mainly. And of course, when we're reading the textbooks for theory, they will be citing this literature as well. The analysis will, of course, be based on the data that the article generated. So we're going to be looking at what kind of data was used, and does this data support the conclusions that the scholar wants us to accept. And then there are two really, really interesting things that I love to emphasize and that we sometimes forget is true. The methods section would be boring if it only told you what it said in the methods handbooks, right? It would be not interesting. And in fact, it would be a little bit uncredible, right? If somebody said, I did exactly what it says we have to do in the methods handbooks to gather this data, right? We would say, well, that's a little bit unlikely that you were able to do exactly what our methods say that you would have to do. Surely something came up. Surely there was some adjustment, some compromise you had to make, right? So what we want is a methods section that is based on the writer's experience. We want them to tell us what they did and how they did it, right? So how do they know that they use these methods? Well, because they use those methods, right? They're writing from personal experience with those methods, right? And that's what we want to make sure there is. We want to get that feeling when we're reading an article that they did something and we understand what they did and we understand why they did it. So we're reading that part of the text when we're saying, what are they saying they did? We did 27 semi-structured interviews with top executives in Novo Nordisk, right? So if that's what they're doing, then we want to get a good sense that they had that experience, right? That they're basing it on the experience of interviewing those people. So that's one thing. That's one place where sort of human reality, something real, right, enters our reading experience. We really get into contact with an actual human being who has actually had experiences and is reporting it to us as though they were writing an essay, right? And we want to try to imagine what they actually did. We don't just want to see the numbers, right? We want to imagine the interviews that they actually did. Right? So when we're reading, we're being much more imaginative there. And then there's the discussion where the implications come out, right? And what's that based on? Well, that's based on reason, right? So we want to make absolutely sure that we recognize when we're reading a text, the person that wrote this thing is an intelligent, rational, reasonable human being with ideas that cohere because they've thought about these things, right? And we want to understand the reasons that they have, right? The logic that brings these ideas together. We don't just want to say, well, they've read a book and it says so there, or they've got a data set and it forces us to think this or that, right? We want to understand how they think, right? So when we're reading, it's one of the things we're going to be looking for down here in the iceberg, right? We're going to be looking at certainly the documents and the literature that they've covered, right? We're also going to be looking at the data that they've collected, right, as a basis for saying it. And we'll be looking at the experience. We'll be trying to figure out what did this human being experience in order to be able to write this paper, right? And then how did they use their ability to think, right? Their capacity for thought, right? It's I think a really, it's undervalued. It's something that we forget really belongs to the foundation, the dignity of the piece of writing. And notice this, that I've said previously, and I'll say this in the How to Write lecture as well, How to Write Talk, sorry, I keep saying lecture, How to Write Talk as well, is that no, I forgot what I was going to say. I have to stop doing that. Right, but in any case, these are the different components that we're dealing with. What I want to do next is break this down to smaller parts, because it can be a little bit, I think, imposing to think, first of all, my knowledge, my ability to think, talk, and write is based on all of this reading, and that's only part of it, because really I have an iceberg just like everybody else, right? I've got all of these things, right? So my ability to so that there's all of this mass here, and then whenever I read a text, I have to think of that as founded in all of this complexity and so forth, right? So how do we go at an actual text, right? An actual piece of writing. And what we're going to do is we're going to take these icebergs and we're going to turn them into something a little more manageable. We're going to turn them into ice cubes. And where are we going to do that? We'll do that right here. All right. So I'm going to just draw a little ice cube. Right. And please notice that ice cubes have exactly the same properties as icebergs. Most of them float over or under the water, and some of them float over the water. And what we're going to do is recognize that every text consists of a finite amount of paragraphs. So if you look in a book, you will immediately see, right, on the pages, these hard line returns that separate out paragraphs. And those paragraphs are not completely arbitrary. Some people have argued that paragraphs are just arbitrary places where the writer wants to give the reader a little break to breathe, right? But that's actually not the best way to think of paragraphs. The best way to think of a paragraph is as one statement of something that the author wants to tell you, right? Which means that for every paragraph, right, we can ask ourselves, what does the author know? Right? The paragraph is trying to tell us something, and we can ask ourselves, what does the author know? Right? What does the author know? How does the author know? What is the author trying to say? Sorry. And how does the author know that that is what that that is true. And so now you can begin to see how your notes for a text can look, right? For every paragraph, you can read that paragraph and say, all right, what is the author trying to say in this paragraph? Identify the one idea in this paragraph. You can underline it as the key sentence of that paragraph. You can say, this is the thing that the author is trying to tell me. And then begin to think about, how does the author know that? Does the author know that because the author has read a newspaper article that tells me that presented those facts to the author? Does the author know it because they've read a journal article, right? Or a series of journal articles and are steeped in a tradition of theory, right? Right? So do they have that scientific literature as their basis for saying this? Does the author know it from personal experience? Right? Is the author telling me this is true and claiming that they know it because they were there, right? They were there doing the interviews. They were there making the decisions about what to ask, what questions to ask, and so forth, right? Is the author saying it on the basis of their data, right? I should believe this because the author has data to support it, right? Or, and this is fair, to have a whole paragraph where the author is not making it up, but thinking it up, right? So the author is drawing conclusions from things that were demonstrated in other paragraphs of this text, right? And so I'm showing you my reasoning, and all I'm doing is bringing things together that I've already demonstrated on the basis of documents, literature, experience, or data, right? So it's that kind of thing that you want to think about when you're reading, is that every text isn't a big iceberg you have to push around in the ocean. Every text is actually made up of a whole bunch of small ice cubes, each of which we can say, well, there's something on the surface, and under it, giving it its dignity, right? There is some knowledge that the author has, right? Are there any questions so far at this point? All right. And I should say that the chat is open as well if anybody has any questions. All right. Well, I think I will actually leave it at that. These are informal talks. I'm not going to hold you longer than I have things to say. Let's take a 9-minute break, and it's 10 to 4 or 10 to 5. And then we will sort of informally, you can think of some questions and we can talk things through based on the things I've said. Oh, no, wait, before I send you away. There is one thing I really want to stress, and I stressed it in the blog post. Maybe that's how I got it out of my system by writing it. So, but I should really tell you this. There's actually a kind of book that's also available in the library over in this section, which reminds me of another book that's also available in the library, just over in this section. There are dictionaries, right? Now, you know, of course, you don't need dictionaries today because you can just look everything up online, and all the dictionaries are online as well. But one of the things you really should be doing when you're reading is when you run into a word you don't understand, is to look it up, right? Instead of reading over it, just look it up. It can be very, very quickly done these days. And it sometimes will adjust your sense of what the entire paragraph or the entire text is saying, right? Because you're learning a new word and you thought you knew what it meant, but actually it means something else. So it can be a very useful thing to do, is just to use dictionaries. And then but that was the thing I was just distracted to tell you. And then the other thing that's over there that you can find, that we have some of, but of course there are other libraries that are better at this and many bookstores that are better at this, right, is literature in the artistic sense, right? So think about reading novels, think about reading essays, literary essays, think about reading poetry, think about reading history outside of your field, right? Like not history of your field, but just history books, you know, just history of civilization type books. Read books by people who are good at writing, right? And make sure you pick those books with a very simple principle. One is be interested in the material, right? So be interested in the story, right? Or the characters or the themes that are in those books, and like the writing. Pick books that you enjoy reading, and read every once in a while. And I would say, no, every once in a while is the wrong word. Read regularly for pleasure, right? Make sure that you find out how to read for pleasure. There's one of the things that I want to kind of emphasize through all these talks as we go through, right, is that if you really want to become good at something, right, or if you really want to say you are good at something, wait to say you're good at it until you know how to enjoy it, right? Some people are really technically good at things, but they hate it, right? So it's something I always tell my son is, you'll be really good at doing the dishes when you know how to enjoy doing the dishes, right? And that's a skill. It's part of the skill. Part of the skill is being able to say, here's the task. I'm stuck with it maybe for 20 minutes, but I know how to do this in a way that makes it enjoyable, right? And that's what really means I'm good at it, right? So I'd really encourage you to do that. And the best way to actually figure out what that means and how to do that is simply to find a book you like reading and just notice yourself liking it while you're reading it. Because then you can try to find that same pleasure in a journal article or in a textbook or in a magazine article. You can say, what are the things in language when I read it that I enjoy, that I like, right? And for some of you, that might even mean going, really non-traditional and saying, I'm going to pick up a book of poetry and just read it and see, what that can show me for language. And I might not enjoy reading poetry. I do, but you don't have to. But reading poetry and not enjoying it might teach me what it is I enjoy about reading prose, right? So have those experiences, have a bunch of different experiences with text, and make sure that there is a recurrent experience that you have, which is one of enjoying the art of reading, right? That's something I didn't want to skip before we take a break.